Order, order. Welcome to today's evidence session. It's a one-off session to question the Chair of Shadow British Railways, Laura Shoaf, and the Minister for Rail, Lord Hendy, on the work of the Shadow Great British Railways. So could I ask you to introduce yourselves a little bit more, please?
I'm Peter, Lord Hendy of Richmond Hill. I'm the Minister for Rail in the Minister of State for Rail in the Department for Transport.
Laura?
My name is Laura Shoaf. I'm the Chief Executive of the West Midlands Combined Authority, but here today in my capacity as Independent Chair of Shadow Great British Railways. Welcome. Thank you.
So, in simple terms, Laura, what is Great British Railways and what's its purpose?
So, is it okay if I just give you a little bit of background about myself?
That would be great,
because it might be helpful just in light of what we're going to say here today. Important for me just to highlight that my whole career and my degree is in urban planning. And most recently I've spent the past 2 decades in the West Midlands working in urban regeneration, but more specifically in transport. I was asked to be, along with one of my colleagues, a national champion for tackling violence against women and girls on public transport. And I raise that because I am particularly passionate about that. And it means a lot to me, and it means a lot to what I want to bring into this role. But I do have experience building capital projects, most recently including the 7 new rail stations we're building in the West Midlands, operations in terms of we own and operate our tram system. But I think critically and importantly for this committee, I really do understand just how important rail is to a place. I believe that it plays a huge part in an integrated network, but it's there to support jobs, it's there to support economic growth, it's there to support the building of homes, sustainability, and social cohesion. But critically, as a daily user of the network myself, I have a relentless focus on what could be better for the passenger. So what are we here to do as Shadow GBR? It's really to deliver the benefits of closer integration and much better partnership working against what is a quite highly fragmented sector at the moment, and with the aim to make some real improvements before Great British Railways is stood up formally. So we are here to provide collective insight and challenge to the direction of rail reform, to emerging legislation, and to the setup of GBR. We're here to provide leadership on culture and the workforce and the capability that will emerge into GBR, and to try to work on now some of the challenges of bringing a number of very large organizations together. So we work as leaders, and it is myself and the Chief Executive of Network Rail, that of the DFT operator, and also the DFT itself, to try to identify what are some very practical steps that we can take now to work towards a better integrated railway, and how we can work differently and model that difference in behavior into the sort of culture that we want to see in GBR. So when we come together, and we do weekly, we are there to act as one team, and to be putting passengers at the absolute heart of the railway, to put freight at the heart of the railway, to integrate decisions now on track and train, which, as you'll have heard in previous sessions, is a huge opportunity. To think about those things that are benefiting, as I said, passengers, freight, and importantly, the taxpayer. And also to think about what can be done to radically improve customer experience, but most importantly, to unite and try to simplify what, as I mentioned before, is really very fragmented decision-making through collaboration, and importantly to me, to make sure that everybody leaves blame behind. So that's just a little bit more. I hope that's helpful about my background.
That's helpful, and that describes aspirations about our rail system that I think we can all sign up to. But what's the actual role for yourself as chair, and what does your day-to-day work, which, as you said, is only part-time, and what sort of level of resources do you have to do just this role?
So I've been asked in this role very specifically to be the convener of those three organizations. And to make sure that collectively we are working together. These are three very large organizations that in and of themselves have tremendous resources. So it's not about setting up another organization at all. It's about making the most of the talent and the teams that we have across three organizations and really challenging them to think very differently about the way that they are working. And where we have operators that are now with the DFT operator, how we start to make some of those improvements that can sort of model what we want to do going forward. So it is about support, it is about convening, it is about challenging, and again, it's also about ensuring that as we move towards GBR, we're able to make some changes now. I don't think anybody wants to wait to see improvements in the railway. So it's a matter of working with those organizations who, as I said, between them have quite large teams themselves, but to help them focus on the priorities of this government, of the Secretary of State, and of the Rail Minister, so that we're sure that we are delivering for them in the short term.
Okay, so you convene a meeting of
I do.
three men, knocking some heads together, no doubt. But what resources do you have for that role?
Well, for me and my role.
How big is Shadow GBR?
Yeah, I call simply on the resources of those three organizations at the moment.
Fine.
Yeah.
And what do you think it'll look like, Shadow GBR, in 3 years' time?
Well, if we have a GBR in 3 years' time, there won't be a Shadow GBR there. So, as I said, we're here to exist and to help through the transition as we move into a GBR. But what I hope it will do is mean that when it is established, it has some very real successes it can look to. It's got some examples of those better ways of working. That we will have made some progress into the culture challenge about making sure that we are working as one team. And I think when you model that from the top and when you model that from a board that's made up of the people who have the responsibilities from that, that's a good way to start to get that message down through the organizations that we're expecting to be working in a fairly radically different way as we go forward.
Okay, and have you been given specific outcomes by ministers?
Yes.
One of whom is obviously sitting next to you. And have the outcomes you've been asked to address changed since the appointment of the new Secretary of State?
I wouldn't say that they've necessarily changed, but I have now had some very clear direction from the Secretary of State about the immediate focus. So it might be helpful just to go through what those areas of focus are. So firstly, it's about integration, and it is about identifying those opportunities for integration between track and train. Really keen that we drive out duplication, that we reduce operational costs, that we break down silos, and that we don't miss those benefits, especially with those train operating companies that are in public control, to try to grow and change in how we use them as an example of what this can really be and what it means for passengers. Then there's a definite focus about standards. So we all want to align around what are the key passenger-focused metrics. So we want to focus really on what is a very safe, high-quality passenger experience. We want to be robust and careful about what kind of performance data we have, and we want to make sure that passengers understand, perhaps at their local stations, what the performance is of their train services, and more importantly, what's going to be done to improve that. And also to bring together more customer insight from across the sector. So a big focus on how we're going to develop and share those standards across the industry. Really hugely important, fares and ticketing reform. So how we're going to influence, implement, and innovate really around fares and ticketing reform. The opportunities to harness technology, respond to the way that people are using the services in a post-pandemic world, and to build off some of the great work that's already been done in that, but that is definitely a huge priority.
And are there milestones for those outcomes?
There will be, absolutely.
Will be.
So we're in the process
yet.
of working through a delivery plan, which I will be delighted to share with you when it's finished. But absolutely about how we're going to measure. Obviously, what you measure is what you value, isn't it? And how we will be able to be held to account by the Secretary of State and the Rail Minister for progress that we are making against those milestones. So those will be forthcoming.
Thank you.
Strategic innovation is another sort of short-term priority for us. So again, how are we going to harness technology, and certainly in line with the AI strategy that the government has released as well? How do we use technology to help drive integration and modernize and innovate the railway? And again, there's been some fabulous work that's been done at GBRX for us to build on. So as I said, in some cases there's great work happening in different parts of the system, and I think it's bringing those pieces together on behalf of everyone and harnessing them. And then finally, maximizing the social and environmental value of the railway. So how do we use our collective resources to make sure that we're providing social benefits and environmental benefits and outcomes? How are we going to make sure we've got a trained workforce for what we need to deliver? How are we going to make sure that our workforce is diverse and represents the country that it is there to serve? How we're going to deal with issues around accessibility and raising standards around accessibility? And then how does this work align with our transition to net zero? So those are the priority areas that we have been asked to focus on. So I don't think wildly different from where we were, but really helpful for us to have that clarity and vision from the Secretary of State.
Lawrence, you had a question.
Thank you, Chair. Laura, picking up on the theme about the engagement work that you're undertaking at the moment, in your current role, do you have the scope to engage with the sector beyond that group of three which meets regularly, and if so, what does that programme of engagement look like?
I do, and I have spoken to all sorts of different groups over just the past few months since I've been appointed. I think it's really important to listen and understand there are many different advocacy groups, but also many different industry groups in the supply chain as to what they want from this program. And I think what's been fascinating is that there's no one that I've spoken to that isn't supportive of rail reform. I think every group I've spoken to would recognize that if you were going to design a rail system, you wouldn't design it from here. This is where we are, but it's definitely not where anybody wants to be. So groups like RDG, Passenger Focus, the freight industry, I've been able to sit down with lots of different stakeholders to try my best to understand what role they can play, because of course it's not just the three bodies that sit on Shadow GBR. There's a vast network of people who are really keen to help promote this agenda, and it's really important that we harness that effort and energy and enthusiasm to get them pulling in the same direction as well. So yes, it's been a big part, and also I think if I might, just given my day job, I've had a good opportunity to speak to some of the other regions, some of the other mayors, to understand their vision for devolution, for their vision for the role that rail plays in their areas, and some of their ambitions for this program as well.
And on the operational side, is there a close relationship at the moment between Shadow GBR in its, albeit very early form, and operators? And I'm thinking particularly about DFT direct operations. Clearly that will be a very important part of the early work of GBR once it is on a statutory footing. How integrated are you able to be in your approach at this early stage?
So just to be very clear, that the roles and responsibilities of the three bodies that make up Shadow GBR are still very much with them to deliver. So I don't have any responsibility for the delivery of services. That being said, they are one of the key players sat around that table, and we spend quite a lot of time talking about how we can all work together to better improve services. But just to be very clear that it is the responsibility of DFTO to operate the services that are in public control, and then the department, through its contractual obligations, work with the existing operators that are still in private control. So through a convening role, we have influence, but just to be very clear that those responsibilities don't sit with Shadow GBR.
And just finally, you spoke, Laura, about ensuring accountability to the Secretary of State and having scrutiny around this programme of work. I mean, the government's been quite clear that Shadow GBR is not a public body in its own right. So I'm curious to tease out, if we can, what those accountability mechanisms look like. It's very welcome that you're giving evidence and being subject to scrutiny in the committee. Is accountability to Parliament likely to be put on a more formalised footing? And just on quite a narrow point, what do the records of the body look like? Are they kept within the department? And down the line, once we're past the policy development stage, are the minutes of meetings going to be accessible so that we can look back at the early intentions of Shadow GBR and then compare it to later performance?
So at the moment, Shadow GBR is held to account by the Secretary of State and the Rail Minister. We meet fortnightly to update on progress. We've been given those 5 priorities, and as I said, we'll be working through milestones in a delivery plan that we will be making public. So that will be that with which we are very happy to be held to account. I'm very happy to come to this committee at any point should the committee want to see me. We do not at the moment keep detailed records of our meetings. As you might imagine, they are challenging, and I want to keep a space at the moment where we are allowed to have rather challenging conversations and challenging each other and challenging on behavior. As it moves further towards GBR, I don't know whether that will change, but at the moment that is how we are governed and that's how we are held to account. So as I said, happy to be in front of this committee or any other should they want to know more about what we are doing. But at the moment, that is how we're planning to produce something that will let the public and let the parliamentarians know what we are here to deliver.
Okay, thank you. I must say, given the importance of this particular policy area, I do find it a little surprising to hear that detailed records are not at the moment being kept, but perhaps we'll get to that point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Rebecca.
Hi. Do you think that Shadow GBR is an effective model for driving reform of the railway?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do, because it is, as I think everybody recognizes at the moment, the system is not incentivized to work together. As I said, that is something that has been inherited. And I think one of the most important things that Shadow GBR can be doing is demonstrating the collective power and impact of what working together looks like. Now, before we have something in statute in order to allow that to happen, being able to demonstrate to the industry, demonstrate to partners, demonstrate to those organizations the power and the change we can make by working differently, I do think is hugely powerful. But I don't underestimate the sort of scale of the challenge and the time it will take to embed sort of different cultures and different behaviors in such what will eventually be such a large organization. So I think that it's incredibly important between now and when it is established to set that direction of travel, to model those behaviors, to identify those things that can be done. And it's been my experience as a leader of my own organization that you need to model that from the top, but that also as things start to change, and those are the people sat around that table that can unlock change in their own organizations, it can be quite a galvanizing force. to trying to change mindset and to get people's heads into what it will be in the future. Getting them thinking about what their role is in it, getting them other people thinking about what they can do differently themselves to try to start making some of those changes across the railway.
And what levers do you have at your disposal? Because it sounds like you're having some chats amongst the different organisations. What levers do you actually have for achieving that reform? And the one specific thing I'm interested in is obviously there's the 4 railway operators that have come back into the department that have all failed. What are you doing to talk to those that are perhaps less problematic about what works? Because it feels a little bit like you're modelling on fixing 4 that have broken rather than taking the things that have worked and using that as your framework for setting up. So I suppose there's 2 questions. What are the levers you have at your disposal, and how well are you using the stakeholder of the existing operators that are not necessarily the ones which want to reform in quite
Absolutely.
the same way?
If you don't mind, I'll take those in reverse order. So it is incredibly important for us to learn from the operators that are doing a great job, and we have a number of examples, that are within the control of the DFT operator who are delivering an excellent service. We have a number of really good examples too of where that integration across track and train is starting to take real effect, and actually where modeling different behaviors across that integration is yielding in better decision making and savings. Now, we absolutely want to make sure that we capture the learning from that, and that learning is able to be shared with other operators that are in a different place than some of the operators that are working really well. And so we do spend quite a lot of time talking about that learning, talking about those teams, talking about how we can roll that out further. In terms of levers, well, I like to think I have the levers of the chief executives of those 3 organizations. I can assure you that there is some real robust challenge in that room, and it is a place where robust challenge can happen. So we all feel a responsibility for making sure that the railways are improving. While each of us don't necessarily have a collective set of levers, individually the 3 other people on Shadow GBR have huge resources to move. So it's about that collective influence and drive to make those improvements, but also working together. So maybe historically, the chair of DFT or the chief executive of DFT operator wouldn't sit down for an hour a week or 2 hours a week with DFT and with Network Rail to talk through some big challenges and issues, and those are the kind of sort of levers that we have to try to drive some of that change. And I can assure you I'm wholly committed to making sure we get some different outcomes through there. So again, they can be very robust conversations, but so far they're yielding some better outcomes, which we're quite proud of.
And are there any additional powers that you feel you might need? Because again, it's one of these things, you've got a short time frame to kind of get to grips on what needs to change. Have you got enough powers within what you're trying to achieve to deliver that, do you think?
At the moment, absolutely, because I think it's really important that what we don't do is to set up yet another organization to hold something to account. I mean, that's the job of this committee, that's the job of the Secretary of State, it's the job of the Rail Minister. It doesn't require another group of people to be sort of holding to account. So yes, at the moment, I absolutely feel I have the levers. I feel we have the clarity. Hopefully soon we'll be able to produce that delivery plan that sets out those really practical milestones of what we hope to achieve. But yes, at the moment, I feel I do have enough of the power and the levers to drive some of that change we've been talking about.
And you can do that without resources yourself, but depending on the resources of one of the 3 bodies or even the DFT. You don't need your own staffing to support you in holding the 3 organisations to account.
At the moment, I don't need a huge team or department to do that. Let me give a couple of examples. So where we've been asked to think about, for example, fares and ticketing reform, we have a fabulous team that's been working at GBRTT in conjunction with the department, looking at some of this stuff. So what I'm really keen not to do is set up another team to look at this stuff. What I'm very keen to do is to work there or with GBRX and innovation or some of the great teams in the DFT. It's about driving them forward with some really clear ambition about what needs to happen, but it's not about replicating the work that is already housed really helpfully in a number of these bodies. It's about harnessing them and allowing them to deliver collectively and in a better way.
Okay, thank you.
Does that make sense?
Baggy, you had a question you want to come in on now.
Thanks, Chair. So the previous Secretary of State said she wanted to move fast and fix things, and I'm sure you guys will agree with that, and everybody I speak to in the rail sector absolutely agrees with that as well, and I'm sure the current Secretary of State also agrees with that. But how will the DfT and Shadow GBR consult with the wider sector to make sure, as well as having plans, we're actually doing stuff and we're doing it at a pace?
So I think we have been consulting with the wider sector in this sort of lead up to producing this plan. As I said, I don't think that it's just those three organizations that have a role to play. Obviously, organizations like RDG have a lot of capability and capacity, and it's about working with them to understand their aspirations for delivery and then helping align them to these programs that I've talked about and defining a role for them. We do, of course, want to move fast. I think it's only fair and right. I mean, I am a daily user of our rail service in the West Midlands. Do I want to see improvements? Well, of course I do. I think everybody who uses the railway absolutely wants to see that. And so we are trying to identify, as I said, some series of some of what are the things that we can do in the short term that set that direction of travel. What are the short-term improvements we can make that passengers will really feel? Some of those ideas are set within the organizations that are around the table with me. Some of those ideas are set out with in terms of the different sorts of partners, stakeholders, and supply chain who all have their own ideas about good things that we can be doing in the short term. We don't want to miss those out. So that engagement bit has been really important to me, and it's why I've given it such a focus in the first few months that I've been in post.
Okay, and then just moving on, this one probably more for Lord Hendy. Can you give us an update on the status of GBR-TT and the work streams it's been working on to deliver?
Indeed. So, yes, good morning, everybody, again. So GBR-TT was a creature of the intent of the previous government to set up GBR. I mean, I think one of the things that maybe gets slightly forgotten in this is we've been on this reform agenda. I've been on it in two different jobs for the last 6 years, and despite the fact that the last government didn't actually produce anything in Parliament which was implementable, GBR-TT was a manifestation of the need to do some work in various areas. So I would say now it broadly it splits into two. One part of GBR-TT is doing some of the work that Laura described, in particular the fares and ticketing reform, but not only that, there's been some excellent financial work looking at the whole finances of the railway, for example, and that can be taken forward under one or other of the wings of the three organisations that comprise Shadow GBR and chaired by Laura. The other part of it was preparing for GBR. Creating GBR has to be a job for the department because it needs primary legislation, and those people have not wasted their time, but what they've done will need to be adapted into and built on in order to create the organisation that will be created as a result of the legislation that we're going to bring forward. So no part of what they've done has been wasted, but taking it forward will be in a slightly different form, which is fair enough because actually this government's got, I would say, a more inclusive view about what GBR actually is and what it would do. And GBR-TT has been helpful, but it didn't have the leverage that Laura's very eloquently described to you this morning about bringing the industry together, for example, whereas actually in the new circumstances we'll manifest that by the production of the major railway bill in this calendar year, and prior to its introduction we can approach all the issues that need to be that Laura's described.
Does that mean GBR-TT will get wound up, and if so, what will happen to the funding for it, the people for it, are they going to be moved into the department or?
So as always, people, the actual people doing that work have to be properly treated. They're as ever, they're decent employees. They work hard, and actually that work is going on now in the light of the subject matter that Laura's described to you, which the Secretary of State has asked her to do. Then GBRTT can now be looked at with a view to the individuals there going in the appropriate direction, whether it's to the department or one of the three or one of the other two constituent bodies of Shadow GBR, in order to carry on what they're doing.
Okay, and I suppose back to Laura, you mentioned the delivery plan earlier, which is good because, again, there's rumours and people saying we've not heard about the progress on the delivery plan and it's not going to happen. So you've confirmed it is still happening, which is really good. So the next question obviously is when, and is there any flavour of what you can tell us what's going to be in it?
So we're, as I think previously mentioned, we've had a change of Secretary of State, so obviously timescales have had to shift to make sure that we are able to really focus on the priorities of the Secretary of State. So as I mentioned, we now have the 5 areas which have been made very clear to us. So the delivery plan will focus on those 5 areas, what we've been tasked to focus on, with underneath each of those, with some of the work streams and the milestones. I don't have a date that I can give you today. We are working on it. It's something I want to make sure is right. I am one of those people who's very conscious of plans being written, plans sitting on shelves. And this plan's really important. It's important to all of us. It's important to me to get it right. So we've got that clear direction now. We are working on it, and I hope it won't be too long till we've got something we're really proud to publish.
And just finally for me on this point, so whether they're GBRTT staff, whether they're DFT staff, whether they're doing the work around or what the transition team has started, we've obviously got people, on seats in Derby. Will that continue irrespective of what happens with GBRTT?
I think that the aim is to not create to have a minimum amount of disruption in order to deliver the things that Laura's talked about. We don't, actually, if you look at this in context, in due course we will have GBR itself. We don't want umpteen organisational changes on the way up there. We've got good people doing good stuff. It just needs to be aligned into the areas that Laura's talked about, the people doing it, put in the most appropriate one of the bodies that exists, and getting on with it. I'm much more concerned about that. I want to look after them personally because they deserve respect and consideration, and I want to look after the work in order that nothing we're doing which is good stops, and indeed produces some results.
Rebecca, did you want to quickly come in?
Just briefly, forgive me if this is I should already know this, but how will DFT operator interact with GBR Great British Railways once it's completed? Do they remain 2 completely separate organisations, or are they the same thing? Or
oh, gosh, no. The thing I've been reflecting on as you've been asking Laura all those good questions is that this industry has been desperately fragmented for over 30 years. Many people of an age not much younger than me have known nothing else but an industry which grinds in these contractual interfaces and doesn't work together. And indeed, if you wanted me to, but you don't, I can tell you some stories about how relatively independent Network Rail has been of either the other 2 constituent parts of what Laura is bringing together and starting to collaborate. So GBR needs to be a coherent whole. It can't be comprised of organisations that are independent within it. The structure of what Laura's doing has to be like it is, because we don't have the legislation to do anything different. But when we do, Network Rail won't exist, and neither will DFT Operator. And indeed, one of the challenges for DFT Operator is to be sufficiently resourced and capable to take in the train companies that it will take, the operations that it will take in over the coming 2 and a bit years, but not form itself into another great beast like Network Rail, when actually the job of GBR is to take those things apart and run them in a coherent way. I'll say one other thing, and I think it's really important, which is that it's too easy to conclude that therefore GBR will be some megalithic sort of Eastern European organisation with a massive office with thousands of people in it. And if it is, it will fail. The railway runs best at a level at which people can be in individual control of it at route and at train operating company level. And actually what we want as GBR gets formed and all this good work is done, we want some results now, which is what Laura's talking about, because passengers deserve to have better sooner. But we also want to create an organisation that works at a level at which passengers can see the result. So, you know, I've talked separately, as you might expect, to the chair of GBR operator, and we're agreed that philosophically he needs just enough people to do what GBR operators should properly do in order to run those train companies, but not to set up another massive structure which then has to be taken apart and put into another structure. We can't spend all our time reorganising everything. And one of the answers to that is to get it right at the level at which the train service is actually delivered to passengers, and have a bit of pressure upwards as well as building it downwards.
That's useful, and we'll come on. That raises other questions which we'll come on to shortly, but I'll now go to Ollie.
Laura, we just touched a little bit about on fares and ticketing. I suppose if I was to be cynical, if I had £1 for every time the industry or government talked about reforming fares and ticketing, I could probably just about afford all lines Rover. We've been told by a few ministers that reforms to fares and ticketing don't need to wait for the legislation to establish GBR. What progress do you think is being made on it, and what role have you been asked to undertake in relation to that as Chair of Shadow GBR?
So there are things happening. So forgive me for being parochial, but I'll defer back to the West Midlands, where we are in the process of working with the department to roll out a pay-as-you-go product. And I think that Manchester is not far behind in that process. So those are some of the examples of some very long fought-for changes to fares and ticketing that we think that can come ahead of legislation, and how those integrate into places, as I mentioned before, is really important. I know it's an aspiration of many areas outside of London to have that same sort of ticketing that is capped, that is multimodal, that refers to a place. So there's some great progress, for example, being made there. In terms of what we've been asked to do as one of those 5 areas of focus, as I said, it's to try to influence and implement that innovation and to build on some of that good work that is already happening, but it's also to challenge some of that work that's happening, again, coming from a passenger perspective about whether that works. As Lord Hendy mentioned, we do have some great teams that are really leading on some of this innovation. They're working with partners in different parts of the world to try to understand how we harness technology. They're working with experts in this country who've been able to simplify fares and ticketing. But it's about sort of systems innovation in order to think about how we do that. I think we've been able to make some progress as well within some of the operators that are currently in DFTO, even just about some very basic changes about ticket acceptance across different operators that are already within. Yeah. So again, just another example of some of the small incremental things that are able to be done. We know what an important issue this is for passengers. We know how fragmented and confusing it can be to try to buy rail tickets, and we're absolutely committed to trying to put some of that stuff in place. We have some really truly excellent people, as Lord Hendy has said, in a number of different organizations who are working on this. And again, our job is really to bring them together, is to give them that direction of travel. And I guess coming back to somebody else's question earlier, I think it would be a great sign of success if in our meetings, if people came in to talk about one of these key priorities and we couldn't identify who their employing body was. That's really the ethos that we're trying to get to, which is, we are all trying to make things better. It doesn't matter whom you work for. The point is, what are you doing to try to make some of those incremental improvements now?
Okay. Steph.
Thank you. Very much related to what you just said. I mean, to me, the scale and complexity of this organisational change programme is fascinating. I know both the Secretary of State and you have mentioned culture change, which is one of those concepts that risks becoming or staying up in the clouds. No one really understands what it means practically. For me, it's very much about the way people think and behave now, and then changing it so they think and behave in a different way in the future. Can you give me any examples from your experience so far of what you've identified sort of being the old behaviour and what you'd hope the new behaviour might be?
Yes, I can. So I think I would focus, to go back to what you said, I absolutely believe that that's right. And I think I started by saying people believe what they can see modelled, right? So how we behave as the shadow GBR, what we choose to measure, and I mentioned some of those performance targets and being really specific about what it is that we think we want to measure, I think from a leadership level starts to set that direction of change. But I believe that it mostly comes from the people who know more than I ever will about what it takes to run the railway. So some of the best ideas that come from my organization don't come from our leadership team. They come from people who are on the front line. They come from people who are serving passengers every day. They come from people who are running stations every day. They see the kind of small changes that could make a big impact to people. And I think one of the best things we can do in working towards a long-term, as you rightly point out, it is a long-term change program and process, is to make people feel empowered to make those decisions. Lord Hendy referred to that a little bit earlier in terms of how operations can work best when people feel empowered locally, regionally, to take those kinds of decisions, to be held accountable and responsible for them. It's been my experience. People want to be able to be empowered to make those sorts of changes. And we've identified a couple of areas so far where we've been able to work with some exemplar operators about where they are empowering their staff and using that as an example to roll out into other operators. I don't underestimate the challenge of the culture change, and I'm not sure that we will deliver it in ahead of GBR, but I do think the way we behave and the kind of signals we send and the way that we treat passengers and staff and the way they feel that they're treated goes some way to starting to drive that journey. But it will be a very big journey, as all culture change programs are.
May I add something to that?
Yeah.
Because I think that, at its simplest, one of the prevailing cultures in the whole railway is that when something goes wrong, you look for somebody else to blame. And it's a very simple, it's almost an automatic reaction. And I can't remember whether I said this last time when I came here, but actually in Network Rail, when I used to look at the morning's performance and I felt tired and weary and, I think, oh, thank God it's not our fault. That's hopeless. That is completely hopeless for passengers and for late-running freight trains. What you want is for people to think, how do we get this fixed? And this is a complex, interactive system where seldom does one actor of the three of the three big organisations that Laura chairs, or indeed the rest of the railway, seldom does one actor have all of the remedial things to do under its control. And that's true even of simple infrastructure failures or staff shortages around the system. They're things that need to be interactive in more than one organisation. If we can, and she's absolutely right in saying that one of the things you need to do is to drive behaviours from the top. If the three chief executives that she sees on a regular basis can be shown to the industry to be working together to solve some of these problems, and what she talked about in shared standards is a particular example. Network Rail has managed and has been asked to manage its performance with different metrics than train companies. How do you resolve that issue? That's bonkers. You know, technical term from the balkanised railway industry. It's bonkers. If everybody knows what you're measuring, at least there's a fair chance that you can agree at least what's gone wrong, or the quantum of what's gone wrong. And I'm absolutely passionate about it, if only because in my previous life I ran an organisation at Transport for London where everything that went wrong was my fault. And we fixed it, or we tried to fix it, simply because there was nowhere else to go. And this railway has to get into the habit of saying this is our problem and we fix it. And I can be passionate about that because I believe in it. I think Laura's passion, and I'm very supportive both of her personal role and of the organisational role, because to be frank, actually the previous Secretary of State was absolutely right. It needed somebody to come into it, the role that she's doing, with some knowledge, but from the outside, and say, let's work together, friends, to make this better. And that's not the habit of the industry, and not the habit, which is learned habit of most of the industry, because it's been fragmented for so long.
Right, Alex, could you...
This is to Laura, really. Do you have a role in the development of the department's wider rail strategy?
I think I will say that we have a role in that the department is sat around that table, and certainly what the railway wants to achieve, absolutely. But do we have a statutory role? No, because we're not a body. But do we have a collective vision for where the railway wants to be that we think should be part of that strategy? Absolutely. So we have a role in that way. It's tricky when you're not an entity in its own right. But I think that collective visioning for a better railway that's done around that table with colleagues from DFT in the room should play a role in that strategy. But of course, it's really ultimately for, at some level, for the government to help set that direction of travel.
And then we've unsurprisingly been talking about railways, a lot of railway stakeholders. I wondered what stakeholders from other forms of transport you're engaging with at the moment. I mean, particularly buses, rail replacement services one day are going to be a big issue, and the issue of ticketing, which is of real concern to passengers who wish to go from bus to train to bus. Is that something that's being thought about at the moment?
So this is very close to my own heart. This is about delivering integrated networks like we see here in London. So you have to think. I have to think about all networks in terms of the different roles that different modes play. And I am a huge fan of bus. And actually, if we want to drive more patronage on the railway, which is something everybody wants to do, and we want to see more revenue on the railway, there are things that we can do along the railway to make it more pleasant for passengers. Some of the things we've talked about today, things we know that matter to people's safety, reliability, integration. But also, as areas are looking to move towards different models for how they manage bus services, we should be working with regions to make sure that buses are feeding the fixed lines of the railway. An integrated service, a joined-up service, would allow us to try to drive more demand onto the railway. And when we're not in a position where we have modes competing with each other, but modes that are complementary to each other, it should be a much better outcome for the railway. Now, that is something that we are talking to regions, whether we're talking to TfL or the West Midlands or Greater Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds. All these regions have a vision for how they want their integrated network to be, and all of these regions have a vision whereby ticketing is simpler, it's capped, it's multimodal, and they almost all have a vision by which the modes feed each other so that it's one seamless network to the passenger. So absolutely, it's a huge critical part. Rail doesn't stand alone in a place. For us, it links up with our tram network, it links up with our bus network, our cycling network, our walking networks, and how it lands in a place is hugely important. And stations, if you just might indulge me for a second, stations are hugely important to people, they're hugely important to places, and where we're able to have interchanges between modes that are really effective. Again, all of that will help to drive passengers onto the railway, which ultimately is what we all need and want for the railway to be successful. So yes, in short, am I talking to people about it? Yes, probably not as much as I like to talk about it, but we absolutely see it as critical and a critical part, both for places to get the most out of the railway, but also for the railway, to drive the kind of economic benefits that it needs to.
Hey. Thank you. Catherine.
Thank you. Laura, you've talked a lot about the need for real cultural change, and Lord Hendy has been talking about concerns around blame and fragmentation and different metrics. But what is your assessment of what has gone wrong with the railways in Great Britain?
I think the word fragmentation is probably the best way to sum it up. Over the past few years, there's been quite a lot of change in direction of travel. I think that has not necessarily been helpful for the industry. But I think, as Lord Hendy said, it's easier for the operators to blame the infrastructure and the infrastructure to blame the operators than it is for people to come together to say, what is it that needs to change in order to make this better for passengers? I feel it's lost some of its focus on what matters to passengers. You can travel on other systems around the world and see a much better passenger experience. As a passenger, I feel that, both in terms of sort of support and operation, information. As I mentioned before, I'm particularly passionate about safety on the railways, so one of the challenging questions I like to ask is why is one of the measurements that we haven't yet been considering is the number of last trains cancelled, which puts people in a really unsafe position. How, to me, on the network that we're responsible for running in the West Midlands, that's absolutely critically important not to leave people at a station at the end of the night. So there's every bit of the industry is incentivized to look at its bit, and I just think it's lost its ability to think in the round about how to creatively problem solve together and genuinely about how to make things better for passengers and for freight users as well. And I think people up and down the country certainly give that feedback, that they feel like an afterthought after the industry. And that the industry has, because it's so fragmented, it's very easily able to default to a very complicated answer to what many people hope was just a very simple question.
And you've also talked about the need to model behaviours, but practically, what can Shadow GBRU and the constituent organisations do to address those kind of issues in the interim?
So we've, I think as we've said before, there are some great examples of where those are already being tackled. So on some of the well-run operators that we've mentioned before, some of the ones that are already within public ownership, where teams themselves are coming together to challenge that kind of behavior and to sort of unite under one vision for what they are there to deliver, and to challenge each other, not to walk into that culture, but actually to think differently about how they align resource together to solve problems, how they work together to solve problems. So I'm quite inspired by some of the great innovation that we see on the ground. Our job is to bring that together. It's to harness it. It's to model it, and it's to try to drive some of that through the rest of the systems and operators that we've got in-house. And again, I think for me, it's really important to find that innovation as close to the passenger as we can, and to really allow those the people that know best about what is influencing passenger stations, railways, etc., to try to bring some of those ideas forward, and then where they're successful for us to be able to try to roll them out across different bits of the network. There's some fabulous work that's going on, and if I was going to say one thing, it's I think we don't shout enough about some of the successes that are happening in the railways. They get drowned out by what are quite rightly some of the challenges that are happening in the railways.
So in terms of making sure that you're enabling those successes to come to the fore and move away from the silos that we've seen, how can the design of what GBR will look like address those issues?
So it absolutely is paramount to how you get the institution set up in a way that doesn't institutionalize those behaviors, if that makes sense. But the design of what GBR needs to be is something that we are working to influence. It's the responsibility is definitely set with the department. So as a board, we work to try to influence the thinking about that, to think, looking, I know there's consultation documents and also bits that need to go through primary legislation, but the whole industry needs to be involved under the DFT's leadership of what the future design of that needs to be. I think Lord Hendy's made some points already about how important it is to get that right, because we can design something that crystallizes the kind of behaviors we'd like to see, and we can design something that builds the wrong incentives in place. So that's in the forefront of mind, and one of the things that we've been asked to look at to try to help influence and shape.
Will that design then be fixed in the legislation?
Lord Hendy, I think.
So the legislation will allow GBR to be set up. The internal design of it to produce the outcomes that you need. You're not going to define the structure of how it operates at a granular level in the legislation, and indeed if you look back in history, no previous set of legislation for the railways has ever designed the organisation underneath it. I think what Laura's describing is influencing, and I think her influence and the influence of the people she sits with regularly is very important, because actually the design of GBR ought to be to deliver the outcomes that people want to see from the railway and not be constituted by the inputs. And that's why I was so determined when I talked about GBR operator and about DFT operator and indeed about Network Rail, because those organisations, if you're not careful, are designed with the inputs needed to produce the functional parts of the railway. What we need is an organisation which is designed with the outcomes for passengers and freight and works backwards, if you like, from that. So actually the influence of shadow GBR on that, whilst it is only influence because it has to be properly formulated in the right legislation, is very important to have the outcomes properly in mind throughout the whole process.
If I may just follow up from that, a lot of the focus around that we've been discussing has been passengers, but you've both previously mentioned freight, and certainly looking at outcomes. The previous goals for freight weren't considered to be particularly ambitious in terms of, I think it'll be the Secretary of State that will set out what the ambition for growth when it comes to freight. But how will GBR fulfil its duty to ensure that we're seeing growth in freight, and what kind of levers do you have to pull in relation to that?
So you're right, it's terribly important, and actually I think that the only way of doing this is for proper interaction with freight operators. You can look at the map of the network and say, well, conceptually freight ought to be on all parts of this network, but realistically the freight that is economic to carry by rail is composed of some clear sectors, containers or intermodal, aggregates and other things like that. So, and what I would like to see is a structure for GBR that enables those flows run by commercial operators to be properly accommodated on the network, with the train paths they need on the network, which has to be a function of GBR, which is allocating space on the network, which is a whole subject in itself. The forthcoming consultation, which I can assure the committee will be out now very soon, which is the preliminary to the bill, will have a lot to say about access and charging, because it's those things that will determine the ability of freight to serve its own market. So there's a bit of watch this space in here. It isn't like nothing is happening now, because actually in the past, I would say 18 months or 2 years, both the department and Network Rail have been a lot more active than they previously were in actually talking to the freight industry and seeking to understand where it thinks it's going next. And indeed, probably I've met the freight industry more often since I've been in this job than I have some of the passenger industries, simply because it's really important. It's really important for them, and they will be paying particular attention to what the consultative document says about access and charging, because they want to see a railway that makes their businesses work and also is capable of expanding the markets that make sense for rail.
Do you anticipate greater ambition for growth in freight than we've previously seen?
It has to be measured over time, and the previous Secretary of State and this one, I think this one has now both reiterated the obligation that will be there for GBR to grow the freight market. It's got to be realistic, simply because the freight market is not likely to double in a year. It needs its own expansion plans. It's got to have wagons and both wagons, track access and freight terminals to actually function. But I expect it to be demanding, and I expect the operators to be demanding.
Right, thank you. We're going to go back to the legislation, Steph.
Yeah, so we've talked a bit about what Shadow GBR is doing now. There's going to be a point in time when it's time to set up GBR proper, and I imagine that setting up Great British Railways has got quite a big to-do list attached to it. There'll be hiring chief exec and senior managers. There'll be answering this question about operating model and organisational structure, which I think is, again, really interesting opportunity to look at. If you're thinking outcomes first, like what sorts of structures serve those outcomes, I imagine they probably might look quite different organisationally to even a typical rail operating company at the moment, and any of the agencies you've mentioned. I guess what I'm interested in is what is Shadow GBR's role in getting ready for creating GBR? Are you looking to build the organisation around you, or are you looking to make it redundant when it's done? Will you be involved in operating principles, organisational design, hiring chief exec, setting up ways of working, or is that something which comes later? And what do you hope to have achieved by the time it finishes, Shadow GBR, if it's possible to know that at this stage?
Maybe I should start. Some of what you've described is clearly the function of the department itself. Hiring a chair and a chief executive. We should start from first principles. You can't hire a chair and a chief executive until you know you're going to have an organisation. So we've got to go through stages. We've got the consultation on the bill, which will, as I said, be out shortly. I'm learning already not to be too definitive about weeks and months, but it will be out very shortly, and we've got to go through that process, because there's a lot of, this is going to be a very substantial piece of legislation, changing things, as I said, which have been largely unchanged for over 30 years. Then we've got the legislation itself. There's a point, I'm advised, in the passage of the legislation through both houses, where it's possible to start actually recruiting people to run the organisation. You can't preempt Parliament's absolute right to make those decisions, and those necessarily have to be a job for the department, and the creation of what's going to be a very large public body will necessarily involve many people, and that is the work of a government department. But what I'd say, and Laura I'm sure can follow up, is that what SGBR and her group of chief executives can achieve in the meantime, in terms of her agenda here and what we've talked about of making the railway better, ought to be a very substantial influence in how GBR actually does its work. And if you detect a little bit of direction in my passion about it working right at a level at which somebody can control it, it's because it seems to me obvious that actually what you want the railway to run you know, conceptually you want the railway to run everywhere, and we all do that, but actually if you're a passenger you want your train to run and you want your station to be okay. And I really, really, really want to see somebody who believes when they wake up in the morning it's their job to fix it, that they don't have to enter a meeting with 30 people and look at 400-page contracts to work out what you do when things go wrong, but they have the power to make the railway service better for the people on the ground this morning and this evening and tomorrow morning. Laura.
So I think Lord Hendy's done a good job of sort of delineating between responsibilities, but you asked about what kind of influence we think we can have. And again, I think it's that bit of challenge as the department starts to think about that sort of shape and structure of it. So, you know, our challenge has got to be, is this going to deliver material benefits to passengers, to freight and to taxpayers? I think that's the right challenge to be asking of any bit of that work. Does it allow innovation? Does it allow people to improve the customer experience? Does it give that accountability and responsibility to the people who run the railway, which I think is important? Is it going to unite and simplify what are fragmented decision making systems that we have now? Will that design genuinely help foster collaboration? Will it try to drive out a blame culture? Those are the sorts of areas of provocation, of challenge, that is the role of SGBR to deliver. So again, that bit of convening those people who know so much about it, who run such massive aspects of it, to ask those really challenging questions of ourselves and of the department as it develops, to help keep that focus. That really is what we're here to do. It's that focus from the Secretary of State and the Rail Minister to constantly be provoking and challenging on what is it really going to deliver? Is it really going to make the kind of meaningful change that's set out in the vision, and that we know that passengers desperately want?
And if it doesn't, in your opinion, who do you go to then?
I have fortnightly meetings with the Secretary of State and the Rail Minister.
So it's not a sort of arm's length scrutiny function. It's a kind of you're in the room talking about it. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. And it was a huge privilege to be asked to do this, to help shape something on behalf of the government. I don't take it half lightly, but also I will give my opinion when it is readily asked, and I think I am both forthright and challenging in calling what I see, because we're all committed to making that difference. And I wouldn't sit quietly in a room if I think something is headed in the wrong direction. Yeah. Just to assure you, I take really very seriously my responsibilities and the great privilege that's been given to me to have a role in this. So I will be robust.
I've never seen Laura sitting quietly in a room. That's why she's there.
And forgive the clumsy metaphor, but when all the bright lights come on and GBR exists, the shadow disappears.
Yes, indeed.
Right. Going to fix a health service.
The shadows.
Yeah, back to the shadows.
and I might say the three organisations that comprise it. Yeah. It's really important not to presume. There as my colleague said in the previous session with the committee, there are functions in the department which have wound up in the department in this 30 years of balkanisation, which ought to be back in the railway. Yeah. And it's very important that of course implies some structural change, and it also implies some changes for individuals, and I'm as mindful of all the individuals in the three organisations for which I'm Secretary of State and I are responsible. And the thing I'd say about that is it creates some wonderful opportunities as well. Yeah. It's a challenge because it involves change, and the industry is sometimes quite resistant to change, but the opportunities for individuals will be brilliant as a result.
Did you have a supplementary?
Yes, please. It was a couple of follow-up questions. Minister, you said that there will come a point during the passage of the legislation in which it is possible to recruit. Would it be possible for the committee to have a explanation in writing of what the barrier is I'm conscious that when the old Shadow Strategic Rail Authority was created, and I accept that it's maybe not an exact parallel, but I think it started with a staff of some 160 people, which had doubled by the time that Royal Ascent had been achieved. And the second question was, there's been some focus on appointment of chief executive and other senior leadership roles, but once that point is achieved when hiring to SGBR can start, do you see its wider capacity scaling up quite quickly and establishing its own identity? I suppose a concern will be that if that doesn't happen, then we could get to the modern equivalent of vesting day, and those three organisations will come under a new banner but might continue much as they were before in a way that I think none of us would want to see.
So I think there are three things in there. Firstly, very happy to write to you about the precise process, if only because I'm a bit befuddled. I know what it is, but I'd have to look for it, and it is quite clear at what point you can do that. Secondly, I think there's a real difference here, because what the Shadow GBR is bringing together some enormous bodies already, and actually I don't think any of us in a railway that costs far more or the net cost of it after revenue is far more than it was pre-COVID. We don't want to recruit yet hundreds more people. I think actually one of the opportunities here is to reduce duplication in an intelligent fashion and actually get things done which turn out to be normal business much more easily than setting up another vast army of people. So, and I'm sure the Secretary of State would have the same instinctive reaction, which is that we don't want to see in this process the necessary recruitment of hundreds of people. What we want to do is to rationalise what we've got and get a better result from it. The third thing I think is that actually throughout the whole process, and I'm sure that I can speak for the Secretary of State for this, the thing that matters most is what happens at ground level for passengers and freight. If we get that right, the evolution of GBR into a functioning organisation will be much better. We don't want it to be all show and lights and not produce anything at the bottom. We want the production at the bottom to get better prior to it coming. We want the three things it really needs to do, which is to improve performance, drive revenue and reduce costs, to be working as normal and standard business, and then GBR to take that over. And that's what I would put in lights, which is the results of it for passengers and freight and for the taxpayers, and not some grand slam of logos and what have you. It'll have to have all of those, but that's not the point of it.
We've got some questions about covering where we go from here and governments and the legislative process, but I just want to pick up it would be useful to have some specifics on what you've actually done. We all agree with the overarching objectives of passenger experience, reducing costs, etc. But could you give us, Laura, some examples of specific things you've either achieved or that you've asked one of the constituent stakeholders to actually do since you've been in this role, preferably something that wasn't already underway, like ticketing?
Yes, so I've been in the role for, I think, since October, so it hasn't been a huge amount of time that we have been meeting. But if I can think about one sort of really specific example, I would think about how we are co-designing across those multiple stakeholders that sit around the table, for example, some principles about where we want to potentially take integration. So we have an opportunity in front of us. We've got some examples about where that is being taken forward. And together we've worked on a set of ideas about over the next sort of 3, 6, and 9 months where we could see that better integration into some of the train operating companies. And again, that is about eliminating duplication of roles. It is about how we're going to target and align resources. So I think I would say that historically maybe it would have been only the responsibility of one of those bodies to design this without consultation with the others and with actually out how to think about whether there's collective resource that we could apply to it to get those better outcomes, and how driving that would make a change for each of the organizations. So without wanting to be too precise, it's not a grade, that is the kind of changes that we're starting to see. So I wouldn't suggest that things happened without people discussing it with each other. In the meantime, there's some great cross-working groups, but at that most senior level, a really strategic conversation about what is it we're setting up to that we want to achieve. The agreement in that room that we all sign up to those principles, and that is a working arrangement which we think we can make work, that is how we think we want to resource it, and that is the timescales. I think that's a step change in what has been able to be done before, and I hope if I get the privilege of coming back to see you after I've been in post a little bit longer, I can point to things that have then come to fruition that we would be there to do, because of course I am as anxious as everybody else to start to deliver some really tangible benefits that I think we would all feel very proud of.
We look forward to that.
And might I add just a piece to that, because I think Laura's being a little bit too modest about it, which is that the agreement between the parties, between the three people that she sits with, about a shared approach to performance measurement is hugely important. And actually, we would never have got there before. We would never have got there because Network Rail was institutionalised with the regulator and the department setting the franchises out, and the DfT operator were on a different plane. And actually, if you're going to fix performance, you've at least got to measure it on a basis where everybody's measuring it in the same way. That's a huge, I mean, it sounds absurd, but it's a huge step forward. And actually, that's been achieved through collaboration. It's not been forced on anybody, and that's one of the things that I think you can properly say is the result of this collaborative working.
Thank you. Scott, you had a question. 12? No?
Question?
Sorry to
So apologies.
12, yeah.
I'm sorry. Really sorry.
Scott's come from another bill committee, so
really sorry it was late.
Yeah, it's okay.
So when do you expect to start the consultation on the way forward? And in particular, I mean, I attended a RIA meeting yesterday, and they made the point that GBR is going to be the second biggest employer in the country, which is absolutely incredible in terms of the scale, and also just those jobs alone, let alone the economic impact it's going to have, is quite incredible. And another meeting I attended recently was open access operators, and you'll know that some of them have concerns, and I have to say I've got a slight conflict of interest because East Coast Main Line is quite well served by Lumo, and I know there's other operators, of course, and I do mostly use LNR, I have to say. But there's lots happening here, so lots of people are concerned and interested and want to have a say. So how is consultation going to work?
I'll say very shortly again.
This is on the bill.
This is on the bill.
Yeah.
This is on the bill, and I think we're on the same page, because we know that this, as I've said before, this is a really major structural change to an industry that's been balkanised for over 30 years. So the consultation raises, for comment by interested parties, some really important issues, of which if you refer particularly to open access, then access and charging are two of the most important. GBR will be a large public body, but it will have work running on its network, people with commercial train services, both the open access operators and freight services. So I wouldn't say that there's been any dilatory activity since the government took office in July. What I'd say is there's an enormous amount of work has gone in and is still dotting the I's and crossing the T's on the consultation in order to put something forward which open access operators particularly will pore over and make sure that they feel that it's fair. We know that there has to be, to the extent to which GBR takes decisions, which you'll see in the document, when it comes, then actually there also has to be an appeal process because they've got real commercial businesses to sustain, and likewise with the freight operators. So the consultation document itself will be pretty meaty, and I think very shortly I'm very optimistic this morning, and with some cause that it will be out very, very soon. We do have to go through that process properly. It would be quite wrong to introduce a bill to both houses which dealt with those subjects without hearing from people about what they're going to see and what they think of it and how reasonable it is for their businesses.
Okay, good. It's good to hear there's progress being made. I didn't mean to imply it wasn't, but yeah. So thank you.
No. Well, it's a very reasonable question because actually the bill process, of course, depends on consultation being issued, a proper length of time for people to reply, a proper length of time to consider what they've said, and then the bill will get introduced.
And just to be clear, I know regulations coming up later in the questions without giving too much away. So as part of this consultation as well, you'll be considering regulation quite carefully, because I think whilst there's concerns, there's also opportunities, but I think a lot of people, I guess what they're looking for is a regulator which really does have real insight into what's happening. I was going to say teeth there, but that's too strong, because there is a feeling that because this is going to be a government operation, that means we need stronger regulation rather than weaker regulation. Is that something that will be considered as well?
It certainly is being considered. The ORR will have to, in the light of the government's proposals, the ORR will have to change, but that's not an indication that it would be weaker in any way. It's got its statutory responsibilities have to reflect what the bill does to the industry, both in economic regulation and to the extent to which it might need to change in safety terms. So that has to be part of this, yes.
Okay.
Sure.
Just to be clear, are you expecting that the bill will come through in this parliamentary session? Because time's getting on.
Oh yes.
It will.
Oh yes.
Because it was promised in the King's Speech.
It was promised in the King's Speech, and we are anticipating that. And I can't see today any reason that I know about why it shouldn't be there.
Okay, thank you. Catherine.
Thank you. When we were talking about some of the things that needed to change, one issue wasn't raised, but which I hear regularly when talking to different rail bodies, and that is a concern that actually part of delays have been created by micromanagement from the department and the Treasury and things. So with that in mind, I'd be really interested, Lord Hendy, if you could give some more clarity on this stage about the relationship between GBR and government in terms of political oversight and powers of direction. And I would find it very useful if you could divide between shadow GBR and what happens before, and then what we expect when GBR is actually in place.
Of course, it's a germane point, if only because the railways, following COVID, now consume a much greater level of public subsidy than they did. So it can't be a surprise that the government itself is going to be interested, and the Treasury and the department. And I think that you'll meet people in the railway who say, well, if only we were left to get on with things on our own, it would be okay. Yeah, well, you're not going to be left to get on with things on your own if you consume large quantities of public money. You're going to have to be accountable for how it's spent and why it's so large. And I think that, I do my best myself in my own way to diffuse those people. You're not going to be left alone to run a railway that requires billions of pounds worth of public subsidy. The government rightly has to have a role, and it also has to have a role because actually running the railway is in order to produce the benefits that Laura talked about to start with, and so will I, which is growth, jobs and housing. That's the aim. That's why the railway better connectivity delivers all of those things, and certainly after the experience of recent governments, this government is committed to doing things about that in its plan for change and growth. So there will also always have to be a close relationship with government. But the question is where some of the decisions are taken and who by, and whether they're the best place for it. Now, I found, not really to my surprise now, doing this job, that after years of endless discussions about the East Coast Main Line timetable for July, in the end the person who took the decision to take it forward for December 2025 was me. I don't think that that's the right place to decide which timetable should operate on the East Coast Main Line. I think that the right place to do that is within a body that's responsible for running the railway and can take responsibility for the individual decisions to go to make a timetable. And the consequence of the history of the railway in this 30-year period is that a lot of those decisions have been drawn very, very closely into government in a way that actually I don't think has suited the public interest nor passengers' interest. And we are seeking to set up an organisation that has the capability of doing those things and doing the things that Laura's talked about well, and doing them for government. Now, that isn't to say that the Secretary of State and a future occupant of this role won't want to both direct it to do some things and have regard to the impact of what it does for the economy, because quite rightly it will. But that relationship would be much better if there weren't several hundred people in the department working out whether I get 4 trains an hour from Richmond in the peak hours or 6. I think the operators in short to be in quite a good position to do that. I'm in favour of about 20 actually, Chair, but
some go on the Hounslow Loop line as well.
Yeah, there's a balance, but the question is, and it's not a bad example actually, because I would expect a competent operator to devise both the philosophy of the timetable and the detailed timetable in order to serve passenger demand in the best way. And there are also some trade-offs, and those trade-offs have to be done on a periodic basis because the market changes, and they also have to. But there has to be a degree of transparency because people are interested in them. But I think that could well be done in a body that actually has responsibility for running the railway and has a balance between the costs and the income. Now, I think my colleague Alex Hines said when he was here last time, we are making some progress already, because actually the business plans for the train companies in the financial year commencing this April will have a balance between cost and income in them, and that's the right thing to do. You can't just take cost out of the industry. If an additional pound's worth of cost brought you, for example, more than a pound's worth of income, that's a hopeless decision. And actually, we already have some of that freedom. The limits on the freedom of GBR, I think we need to give it some to start with, and we need it to earn some by its performance. And it wouldn't surprise me to discover that probably the people who run it will say, oh, well, if we only had more freedom, we could do X and Y. But that itself would be a welcome change, because actually there's no such interaction going on now. If you're a holder of a contract with government to provide one of these services in the private sector now, the government just tells you what to do. And then anything that you might think is bright, you've got to negotiate your way through quite a long process, and actually that's not right either. That suppresses initiative and doesn't bring it out. I'm hoping that gives you some clue. The Secretary of State in the end will have to have some power of direction. It's quite inevitable, and if you run a body of this size and covering the country with its economic and political and social responsibilities, that must be right. But it must have the capability of making many of those decisions itself. And I would go back to what I've said about about local and route management, which is that you would feel much more assured if somebody who, and I'm addressing this at the chair because she and I are on opposing sides of the Hounslow Loop line, you would feel much better if somebody was responsible for the whole of the train service and infrastructure on the South Western, who was identifiable, who could come and rationalise why they'd taken the train service decisions they had, and they knew that it was their decision to take.
I think if I just can follow up, I think it's one thing absolutely for Secretary of State to set direction, and absolutely that's right. But it is anticipated that that GBR will be arm's length, isn't it? And I think some of the concerns arise from certainly the view that when you are talking about taxpayers' money, that actually more has been spent because of delay and micromanagement at lower levels rather than setting that direction at the top. Is that something that you would recognise, and do you feel that there will be progress away from that?
I certainly recognise the view, and indeed I referred earlier to the East Coast Mainline timetable. Now the purpose of the timetable change in December 2025, we have to remember, is to produce the train service which was promised for an investment of several £billion into the East Coast Mainline. The failure to be able to agree between all the parties what it was has delayed those benefits over months and months and months. That is a decision that I wouldn't expect a minister to take. I would expect GBR to take, and I'd expect it to take it in the knowledge of the individual markets that the train companies serve, of the balance between the costs and revenues on the East Coast Main Line, and to take into account the enormous sum of public money that's been put into the investment that will allow faster train service to Edinburgh. And that's a really good example of a decision which has taken a long time, and should have been done faster, but couldn't be done in an organised railway and will be able to be done in GBR.
Thank you. Alex.
Thank you. In light of this government's keen interest in regional devolution, are there plans to regionalise the structure of GBR? And if so, how will that work?
So I would say it must be regionalised, and it must be run at a level where you can have people in charge who are responsive to local and regional needs. And when I was here before, I referred to Alex Hines, who was then sitting next to me, who ran both elements of Scotland's railways. Scotland is, of course, a devolved administration, but we also now have the increasingly powerful position of the combined authority mayors across England, of which my colleague here works for one of them, and their influence will have a statutory role in the development and operation of train services in their areas, and quite right too, and that will be the means by which we produce the integrated transport that they need to produce the economic growth, jobs and houses in their own areas. And I'm sure that you'd want to say more.
Yeah, absolutely. So this government's devolution white paper actually is quite specific about the roles of regions in rail, obviously with more information to come and specifics to the railway bill. But it does suggest that there will be a more powerful role regionally for thinking about how we govern regional railways, how we manage, how we plan, how we develop them. A role in and around stations, I think I mentioned as really important assets to place. And I know, as I said, referring to the job I do in the West Midlands as a co-signatory to our rail operator, just how important that is. Our mayor chairs that board. We're holding to account on performance for our region, for passengers, for really important issues around accessibility. Lots of regions have very clear visions about how accessible they want their networks to be, their whole networks, as you say, from bus to tram to train to walking and cycling, and how we can work with regions to deliver their views for how it fits into their network. I would say really clearly, it doesn't stand alone in the day-to-day running of our economy, or where we think about where we're planning houses or wanting to see economic growth. Rail is absolutely integral to that. So it's got to have a bigger role for regions and mayors who are themselves democratically accountable and themselves all have a vision for what the role of rail is in their place and making their place a success, both for themselves but also to UK PLC.
Okay, so following up on that, in terms of the structure of GBR, are you suggesting therefore that it would be structured around MCAs that exist at the moment and further bits of devolution? Because, for example, at the moment, if you would look at a network rail region, it's very different. They're triangles that go into London, whereas mayors obviously are surrounded, have an area which they surround. So how would the structure of GBR work with these regionally elected mayors that you're talking about? And also, obviously in your own region, you've got Transport for West Midlands. So what do you think, how do you think regions that don't have the equivalent of passenger transport executives, how would you see that they would be able to feed in the same way that regions do?
So in terms of railway geography, well, it's self-evident. Local authority and combined authority boundaries seldom replicate railway geography, which by and large emanates from London. But let's use a practical example of which I've got personal knowledge, which is that Transport for London took over parts of the National Railway Network now 15 years ago. And those parts were distributed through various train operators and network rail regions. We found a way of working together by having an informed client at our end and working with willing railway people at the other end. And there'll be some combined authority areas which happily sit within a natural railway geographical boundary, of which the West Midlands is one, and there will be some that don't. And in the cases where they don't, and in particular in the north of England, where there are several combined authorities across on each side of the Pennines, then one of the responsibilities of GBR is to find a way of running the railway which both respects its operational boundaries in a way that makes sense for the train service, and also is able to address the absolutely legitimate needs of the mayors in the furtherance of their local economies. Now, I think that it's not impossible. It's always going to be a bit messy at the edges, but actually there's nothing new in history. And the important thing is when GBR is sitting down with each mayor, that actually the mayor is facing somebody who is actually capable of being responsible for what the mayor wants to execute in their own area. And you know, there's a great geographical history of different route boundaries and so forth. But actually, at a working level, you've just got to find an arrangement that works, of which London is actually the most complex example, and actually it works quite well, because there's an informed client on one side and a willing supplier, if you like, on the other.
I think the devolution white paper is trying to grapple with some of those questions around geography, the emerging mayoral combined authorities, the differences between some of them in terms of maturity, and certainly in terms of having as was Passenger Transport Authority, Transport for West Midlands is part of the West Midlands Combined Authority, and a number of the other major metropolitan areas have the same. However, I recently met, for example, with the new Chief Executive of the East Midlands Combined Authority, which of course does not have Passenger Transport Authority with, from which to build, and obviously they will have ambitions in the East Midlands about what they want to achieve. But in the meantime, the bodies that have been, whether they're counties or Mets who have the transport authority roles, whether they are themselves the transport authority, should and probably do have a vision of what they want to achieve. So we will continue to work with them, I think, as they evolve. But it's interesting, really, where the devolution white paper seems to be taking some of this. But I think it's been my experience that most mayors find a very firm voice in and around transport, as we were saying earlier, because of how absolutely critical it is to them, to the economic success, and to the other things that they want to achieve in terms of enabling infrastructure, alongside sort of, energy, digital, and transportation. Those are the things that help build those areas up. So I know that they will be of primary importance to mayors of all different types of combined authorities, and meeting with them early, understanding how to work with them and how to get their ambitions together. I think, as Lord Hendy has said, the nature of the railway means it will be messy at the edges. There are always going to be decisions that have to be made about trade-offs. That goes back to the sort of ways of working, the sort of collaboration, and those early conversations to make sure that everybody's ambitions are heard and understood. And then the rationale for why decisions are taken is how you get to the best decision making. So it's really important. And again, I look forward to seeing what happens with the next stage of the white paper, because it does have a major influence in terms of where SGBR and eventually GBR goes.
And I should just add that actually neither we nor the mayors are waiting for this. You'll see published only yesterday the rail ambitions of Mayor Burnham of Manchester, which are granular in their detail, have been discussed with both the department and with the constituent parts of SGBR, and he's not waiting for GBR, and he doesn't need to. We're joined up enough to be able to work with him to deliver what he wants, hopefully over the time periods that he's set out.
Okay, thank you. Lawrence, did you have a question here?
Thank you, and I think all of us who support this policy agenda would still recognise that there are success stories to be drawn from in terms of London Overground, Merseyrail, and some historical examples of how regionalisation worked under the British Rail days. But I just wanted to ask about where disputes might arise. So I think we'd all hope that most problems could be resolved through careful planning and collaboration, but in circumstances where regional and national priorities were in conflict, an example might be local aspirations to integrate rail and bus timetables, which might come into conflict with intercity and freight priorities. Where those problems couldn't be resolved through discussion and planning, how do you envisage dispute resolution of that nature working?
So, I think, in fact, I can't quite believe that you would get disputes over the level of railway services in modal integration, because actually the railway, sadly, even in this new world that we're devising, is going to be relatively inflexible in the terms of the use of trains and so forth, and the bus networks are naturally more flexible. The difficulty, I think, which Laura can describe, and so can I from a past life, is actually making those people talk to each other. If you talk about the interaction of local services with regional and national services, as I said, there may well be disputes, but they're solved actually not by some massive arbitration mechanism, but by actually interaction between an informed client and an informed railway. I can quote you some very practical examples. When we extended the overground to Crystal Palace and West Croydon, you might have envisaged a circumstance where actually it prevented enough trains running from London Bridge to Brighton that would disrupt long-distance travellers. But actually, if you have an informed discussion between people who understand what the capability of the railway is, you come to a compromise about what can be done, which will serve both markets. The interesting thing about that is that the net result of that discussion was not a diminution in the long-distance services on the main line to Brighton. It was an improvement in the timekeeping of the ones that ran, because there was sufficient interaction to devise a train service that operated better than the one that was previously there. So I think you can get some answers out of this. And also, of course, if you look at the position of particularly of combined authority mayors, they must have an interest, as indeed Mayor Burnham does, and Mayor Parker in Birmingham, and others in the West Midlands and others. They've also got an interest in long distance travel. They're not islands which don't need connectivity with London. If in the absurd extreme example, both mayors could insist on a local service that devastated the long-distance services to London, but you wouldn't do that. And actually what you want is to interact with a dynamic railway that can help devise the right service patterns to service both markets.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, sorry. I'm just going to ask our witnesses just to make your responses a little bit briefer, please.
Of course.
And we like specifics. But Lawrence, sorry.
Only trying to be helpful.
Very quickly.
On the principle that anything that can happen will happen, would you accept that there will need to be some dispute resolution mechanism, even if it's of the last resort?
I suppose I would, though actually I don't see that happening very often.
Okay, thank you. Rebecca, you want to come in here?
Chair, so just on this whole idea of regionalisation and devolution, etc., it strikes me that there's a potential fly in the ointment here, which is that the devolution for the non-existing mayor combined authorities, which are the ones that always get mentioned in this committee, and they're the big cities, don't reflect the devolution packages and what the outcomes are going to be in quite a lot of the peripheral parts of the UK. All of those deals are not likely to be determined before potentially Shadow GBR runs its course and is finished. So, you know, without meaning to sort of be difficult, how can you figure out what it's going to need to look like for example, the southwest or, you know, the far bits of East Anglia or something that aren't Birmingham, Manchester, Bristol, and where ultimately we're not going to know what that devolution, or that devolution is not even going to exist for another 2 years. How do we make sure that we don't then end up with a two-tier system where the existing combined authorities get the sort of gold-plated, plenty of cash, they're already miles ahead, and everyone else sort of is made to fit within GBR as it's been formed, and it doesn't quite mesh? What would you think on that?
So I think the Southwest is a really good example, and without testing the chair's direction over time, actually in Cornwall, which has both developed an exceptionally good bus network, they've also been very active to make sure that the railway in Cornwall delivers their objectives, and indeed are sponsors of the Mid-Cornwall Metro project, which is you know, probably in recent history quite a surprising development from a relatively distant and quite small part of the country. I'm seeing the transport lead for Devon quite shortly. They've had their own successes in terms of opening stations, and the key to that, I think, is for the railway to be sufficiently responsive for the authorities, whoever they are, the transport authorities, to produce reasoned cases for investment and improvements in services which have to deliver in the end the growth, jobs and housing that we're talking about, and for the railway to be organised in a way that's responsive to them. And I think that actually those are two quite good examples of things that are going on now that I would expect to carry on happening. And of course you're absolutely right, not everywhere will have is a massive conurbation with a powerful urban mayor, and the railway organisation has to adapt, and that's again why I'm so keen to emphasise the need to run the railway on an integrated basis on a route, and as you would see it, a present route and train operating company basis, because you need people there who are sufficiently granularly knowledgeable about those areas to be able to respond to the legitimate demands of local transport authorities.
Can I give a brief follow-on from that, which is just to say that one of the things that we need to focus on in Shadow Great British Railway is that the railway matters to all parts of the country, and in some rural areas it is the only transport option and the only transport choice, so could arguably be even more important than in areas where there's a vast range of options of different ways and modes to travel. But also that counties all over the country have local transport plans themselves. They have their own visions, and they'll have just as much of a voice as everybody else.
So
we can't have a two-tier.
Arguably, with local government reorganisation, those counties are not going to exist in the same form. So I suppose final point is: are you talking to MHCLG? Are they a kind of key stakeholder? Because ultimately, the model of local government that we're currently sat with is not what it's envisioned to look like in 18 months. So those stakeholders, those decision makers are going to move. Are you in conversation with that department to make sure that what you're developing works in tandem with what they're suggesting?
Yes.
Great.
Okay. Okay. Ollie, did you want to come back on some more on regulation?
Yes, Lord Hendy, what role will the Office of Rail and Road play in the regulation of GBR, do you anticipate?
So let's deal with its two principal activities separately. The first is safety. Safety on the railway is absolutely paramount. There's a long and very good history of safety regulation. That must continue. The thing that will have to be adapted is that individual parts of the railway have licences to operate in safety terms, and as we evolve into GBR, that evolution will have to happen. But when I referred earlier to building up DFT operator, one of the reasons that DFT operator needs to be built up currently is because it is in practical terms the public sector owning group for now 4 but shortly more train companies, and it has to have the right safety resource and the right board safety, and the ORR has to see that through. So that's one part of it. The economic regulation, well, there clearly will need to be still need to be economic regulation, because GBR, as we've said, will own the infrastructure and be a very major operator, but not the only one. And the people who are operators, who aren't part of GBR, will rightly expect GBR to make fair and reasonable decisions, and they'll also expect an appeal mechanism if they think it hasn't. In order for GBR to make its fair and reasonable decisions, it will have to have its own codes of practice. It will have to show how it's worked out that what it's done is fair and reasonable in order that it can be appealed. So the role of ORR will have to evolve to embrace that. It will also, we haven't talked yet today about the Passenger Standards Authority, which will also be created, at least for the railway, by the Railways Bill. And there must be a question about if it's going to be a body with teeth, then who does its enforcement? So I think I would expect currently that the ORR is proposed to do its enforcement, because it's an enforcement agency rather than a passenger agency. As you see the consultation, as you see the bill, so those functions in the ORR will evolve. It will still be necessary, but from memory, it's got 21, I think, statutory obligations currently. We don't want it to do anything that it doesn't need to do, simply because the other danger of this, as was true in Network Rail, at least in some of its previous iterations, is that you want GBR to face the customers and not face the regulator. Famously, one of Andrew Haynes' predecessors at Network Rail, when he was asked who his customer was, he said it was the regulator. That's not right. That isn't right. The regulator's there for a purpose, but it can't replace the customers on platforms and the consigners of goods, and that's a balance that we have to achieve. And when the consultation is published, I'm expecting there to be enough detail in it for people to respond to it in that way.
What you've said in relation to open access passenger services sounds very reasonable. And speaking of customers, a lot of the open access operators have very high levels of customer satisfaction and have driven growth, etc. But a recent letter from the Secretary of State to the ORR, I felt, had a somewhat ambivalent vibe in relation to open access operators, giving a bit of a steer to the ORR in terms of concerns about revenue abstraction and capacity allocation. So what role do you see the ORR having in holding GBR to account in relation to that potential for open access and indeed their existing access rights?
Well, I think to save time, I think I just answered most of that in the previous question. I mean, the Secretary of State's letter, you would expect me to say this, wouldn't you? I thought it was a perfectly reasonable exposition of the balance that needs to be adopted. Because after all, the public purse is paying for is ploughing money into the railway in a huge sense. But also, we know that open access has provided some very valuable connections to places that wouldn't otherwise have direct connections. So I think that was, in fact, no more than a statement of the obvious about what the balance needed to be, and in the consultation and indeed in the bill, we'll have to show we'll have to show that we've devised processes that allow both a fair process for the open access operator and a fair deal for the taxpayer.
I just want to finally expand a little bit on the earlier discussion about freight. A report published today by rail partners called A Greener Track suggests rail freight costs have risen 3 times more than road since 2015. What role do you see ORR and GBR having in creating or reforming the regulatory environment to enable rail freight to thrive, perhaps particularly from an access pricing perspective?
Well, clearly there have to be some access pricing rules that allow freight to flourish, and probably there needs to be a bit more flexibility in access pricing to allow new flows. There are some arrangements. There's a fund. There are some arrangements now which give new flows a fighting economic chance of being established, and a bit more of that I think would be very helpful. And again, you'll have to see in the consultation and then in the bill itself mechanisms that allow that to happen. I haven't seen that report, but clearly the comparison with costs of road are in 2 areas, one of which is railway costs and the other of which is road costs. And in this respect, we can only be concerned with railway costs. But I do think that actually we do need to demonstrate a flexibility in access and access charging that allows the freight industry, and we were talking earlier about growth, and it allows it both to be commercially successful and to grow.
Okay, thank you. Catherine.
Thank you. I'm really interested in the social and environmental outcomes that GBR will be focused on. So can I ask what role GBR will play in addressing the really concerning skills shortages that we are seeing in the rail industry?
GBR or SGBR?
Well, I guess GBR would be addressed maybe more to Lord Hendy,
Yeah.
and then certainly what SGBR are doing in preparation for that.
I can answer that. So I think in terms of what SGBR can do, I think this is really important. Even just talking about freight, when we talk about the societal impact of it, but also the environmental value. I don't want to lose that bit about the role that freight on rail plays in helping to deliver some of our environmental aspirations as well. But I think there's quite a lot of work that can be done, and there's quite a lot of good work already happening in terms of thinking about the future skills requirement. I know that, again, in my day job, that making that link, I hope, between departments as well as the government's looking at a national skills agency. One thing I would like to do is to start to think about how we work across different government departments to think about how we make this case for the future needs of the rail industry, and how, as a country, we come together to try to deliver some of that. There's obviously the rail campus in Derby. There's a huge amount of work there that's going on with the supply chain and opportunities in Derby, which I think we would all like to see recognized and built on in order to deliver on some of that. Accessibility, the transformation to net zero, all of that needs to be obviously flushed out into a number of deliverables that we can start to work on in all of that. But it would be really quite shameful, given we know the ambition of the railway and we know some of the challenges facing young people across this country, if we weren't able to try to start to work together. As I say, that's not just one thing for the Department for Transport, but that's sort of cross-government in an ambition to try to bring young people to understand the skills that they can help develop now to be working as part of the workforce of the future. Inevitably, those will change, the way that things inevitably change through technology and harnessing technology to do that. But that's got to be a massive opportunity for the country itself to try to think about making sure it's got the skills for the future of the railway. I think accessibility is a big bit of that. Sorry, did you?
Could I just follow up on skills for one moment? I think do you envisage a specific role that GBR will have on skills? Certainly one element when you're talking about workforce planning, you get a lot more investment in workforce when there is a clear pipeline of work, and one of the inquiries that this committee will be looking at is trying to seek to end boom and bust and have clear pipelines of work. But are you seeing that need to be driving skills from private companies, or will GBR itself have a very clear role in ensuring we're meeting that demand?
So two things, one of which is in respect of rolling stock, which is I think one of the areas that you're looking at quite clearly.
Definitely vested interest.
Indeed, and quite rightly too. One of the things that GBR actually we're already thinking about in advance, as usual, but GBR will be directly concerned about is the long-term future of the rolling stock industry in a way that actually fragmented decisions taken by individual franchise holders has not been able to achieve. And we would all like very much for the whole industry to see what the order book will look like over a period long enough to allow the individual manufacturing and assembly plants to invest in both skills and the necessary equipment. That work has started already and is of course highly desirable, because this sort of boom and bust stuff in rolling stock manufacturers has both put previous plants out of business and created new ones which have uncertain futures. So that we're on that case already, and GBR being established will only make that stronger. The other point that we haven't mentioned at all, but which is hugely important, and is the cause of quite a lot of poor performance at the moment, is the shortage of drivers across the industry. It's not been the case for over 30 years that anybody has looked at that in the round. This year's business plans, if Alex was here, one of the specific things that we've insisted that he looked at, to be fair, he was going to do that anyway, whether we insisted or not, is to look at the maximum output of driver training for every train company in Britain for next year, because all over the network there are large shortages of drivers, which is impacting the real performance of passengers. And GBR must take a view on that. It must take a view because it's part of the future of the railway. It should also take a view because there are many, many jobs to be occupied by a diverse collection of younger people. Half the drivers, in my memory is not, my memory is that over half the drivers on the railway are over 50. I think that's right. So you can see that there's an enormous pipeline to be filled with good jobs for people, and we want to stop people having to work rest days. I agree with the trade unions. It's not desirable for people to do that. A railway should employ enough people that it can run on 5 days a week out of the 7 that it should run. So there's a big job there to be done, and I think that GBR will be well placed to make some real strides in that. The third and last thing I'd say is that some of the train companies have been very good at doing things like giving school leavers who don't come out with many qualifications some coaching and help in actually writing CVs and getting them a job. I saw 20 or 30 of them in a long-running scheme by GTR last week, which was great. The question you'd have to ask is, if that's good there, why isn't it done all over Britain? And we could get that done all over Britain by a GBR that says this is a job that we can do.
Acknowledging the real value of pipelines, would that also apply to looking at how we progress electrification and ensuring that we retain and increase the skills enrolled in that?
Yes, I'm sure that you pressed into my hand no less a letter from Network Rail that appeared to be rather disjointed, and indeed I have a question to ask in the other place, in the other place this afternoon about just that. Yes, we should be doing that too. In all of the areas of railway supply, there are 2 reasons for doing it, one of which is not to waste skills when there's a downturn in work, and the other is to make sure that we've got a good domestic industry so that we can sell it abroad. It's hard to do, and it's hard to do in circumstances where there isn't going to be nearly enough money to do everything we want, but I think we can do better in the future than we've done in the past.
Thank you.
So you had a quick question on skills.
Yeah, very quickly. Firstly, it's great to hear there's so many drivers who are over 50. It means there's still hope for me yet. It's
secure job. Pay.
More than this one.
But yeah, more secure than this one, some would say. So I'm old enough to remember when HS2 first started to gain momentum, and there was real engagement with, I think, colleges at Derby, I think memory serves me right, Leeds, Birmingham, and also where I used to work at Heriot-Watt, and a lot of these institutions recruited people and built capacity. So it seemed back that there was a real effort, a real focused effort of a real discussion with the sector, for training right from the private sector right the way through universities, even university research. So is GBR or Shadow BGR, are you looking at that level of engagement where you've actually looking at the whole breadth? Because what you described to Catherine seemed like quite a lot of kind of quite fragmented responses. You're actually looking at it in quite a coherent way and engage with the sector right from early start training through driver training right the way through to driving the research agenda as well. Because there's a lot there.
There is a lot there. I mean, the other thing you're bound to say is that a long-term infrastructure plan, which is a real aim of government, has within it not only the production of better infrastructure to make the economy work better, but it's also got it's also a real driver of investment in skills and technology in a way that fragmented decisions aren't. And I think one of the great sadnesses about the peremptory decision to abandon Phase 2A of HS2 is that the second-order consequences of that in the construction and equipment industries were not thought through, clearly not thought through, because it was a decision taken in very short time. And every time you do that, you damage the confidence of the industry to invest in people and skills to do more later. So, we are working in very straitened economic circumstances on plans for the railway, which we'll look at over a number of years, and the government more widely is committed to do that across the whole of the infrastructure industry, and the consequences of that will be enormously beneficial for skills and employment, because those companies have to have the confidence in the future market to want to invest in the skills and employment now.
Yeah, thank you. I'll pass you back to Chair. I'm sure you've triggered her by talking about HS2.
Well, I think that we haven't covered future rail capacity issues because presumably that's not relevant to GBR, because that'll be government in association with Parliament for whether it's HS2 Phase 2 or other rail capacity improvements.
I think the only thing I'd say, Chair, about that is that a GBR that has people at the right levels thinking about what investment the railway needs will put forward a much more coherent view about what needs to be invested. One of the weaknesses of the current structure is that if you're a Network Rail, which I was, your answer to everything is infrastructure, because that's what you do. Yeah. That's not the answer to everything. There's a sequence of this which is quite clear, which is an integrated body. If you want more train services, the first thing you do is see whether you can do it with the same number of staff and trains. You might then have to employ some more staff. You might have to buy some more trains. You might have to expand some of the stations. You might have to fix a signalling, and only at the end of it would you buy more track. But actually, that's not the way in this country we've thought about this for a long time. We have grandiose schemes for installing vast quantities of new railway across Britain without anybody seriously considering whether the transport and economic effects of that could be delivered in a more economic way by the existing system. And if we get that right, then the investment propositions that will come forward will be the ones that actually deliver the most for the country and will be far easier for the Chancellor and the Treasury.
That's a very sensible answer, but I don't think there's many people who dispute that we need more rail capacity north of Birmingham towards Crewe and Manchester, etc.
Well, I think it is a separate...
And the Ely Junction is the other one that keeps coming up.
I agree. That's not an argument for not investing. It is an argument for producing a more coherent list of investments.
And I don't think anybody would disagree with you on that.
Absolutely.
Okay, one last question from Baggy.
Thanks, Chair. My favourite subject, Derby and the headquarters. So an announcement's been made, commitment for headquarters in Derby. Can you just share with us the progress made on the actual headquarters has there been any scoping been done on size and the function of it?
I would say not as much as you would want, because I can imagine that you and your colleague would be hugely interested, but it will emerge from the processes that we've discussed this morning, I think, well, Laura.
Yeah, I mean, it has been decided that will be the headquarters, and that is fantastic. And I think there are a number of work streams that are ongoing, both with the county council. Again, I know that this is of primary importance to the East Midlands Combined Authority and potentially to the mayor of the East Midlands in making this happen. And obviously, as we were just saying, Derby is the headquarters. It's got, I think, 40,000 supply chain jobs located there, and the vision and the ambition for the rail campus is really exciting, and one I think everybody wants to see realized. I think it's as the plans for what GBR looks like, size, scope, shape, will help to influence that. So I suspect it will be an iterative process. But what we're going to do, what could happen there around skills and training and opportunity and innovation as a sort of a cluster and a center for excellence, I think is at the forefront of the thoughts of certainly the people sat around the table of SGBR. And I think the full commitment to work with Derby and with yourselves to understand what the scope of that opportunity is and how it gets delivered.
Then just quickly, then, when do you think we'll get some more details? But with that in mind, can I, and on behalf of both of us, invite you to a visit of Derby?
I don't live too far. I've been there many times, but I would absolutely love that, and I'll specifically would like to come on a day when I could meet with you both there.
Excellent.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone, and Laura Shoaf, Lord Hendy, thank you very much for your evidence, and please do feel free to write to us if you think there's anything you would like to add or that we didn't touch on, particularly today. So we found the session really valuable. I think others listening or watching will do too. That concludes today's meeting.